Okay, the thing we gotta understand is not everything is comic books. Okay? So, there's this obsession these days of like everything's gotta have rewrites and reboots and sequels and requels and prequels and something else and more, and let's do it again, but with different characters, and this time they're in space, or now they go back in time, and now they have laser guns, and now it's gender swap, let's race swap, and let's rewrite the characters, and let's use the same names, but they're completely different stories now, and there's nothing consistent, and no one knows what's going on, but it's all good fun. And you know what? Hey, in comic book land, that's kind of fun. It's a cool phenomenon, but that's just not what all storytelling is. That's not what all storytelling was or even should be. It's just a fun game we play for this thing called marketing. You see, comic books have their origin in this thing called pulp fiction. The term comes from the cheap kind of paper they used to print it on because they were just cranking out stuff to be fun. Everyone ever heard of Varney the Vampire? That's where it all began. You see, it was all good fun. And over time, some ideas would stick. And they would make it again, and they would expand upon it, and that's where we end up getting Superman and Batman and all these more popular names. And through this medium of, some cool stories happened. But see, eventually, those cool stories were written again, and then rewritten, and then rebranded and written again, and rebooted, and because they're all being made for entertainment. And that's great. And it created a very interesting phenomenon where we have these kind of like legendary stories about legendary characters, but they have no canon. There's no real version of the story. Not just because it's fiction, but because even within the fictional context, there's no consistency. We have new versions with new authors, new generations, new ideas, new executive producers behind the company that owns the whole thing, and it just changes over and over again. And that's all fine and well, but that's just not what everything is. And that's kind of what's happened nowadays, is we're trying to turn everything into comic books. Star Wars, for example. Star Wars is not comic books. But that's what Disney did once they got a hold of it. They just tried to turn it into comic books. Let's just making, let's have another mini-series of spin-offs and prequels and sequels, and no real regard to the canon, just no real regard for even really storytelling. Let's just crank stuff out. And it's just a hold on the phenomenon, and it doesn't work. When you have some things designed to be comic book, it's fine. You want to make a new version of Superman? Sure, whatever. There's been dozens of versions of him in the last, 20 years. There'll be dozens more in the next 20 years. You just can't take something like Star Wars and do that. You don't get to just rewrite it and change it. Some stories are crafted. They have a mythos to them, a purpose to them. So you have to actually acknowledge and respect that purpose, or anything you add or take away from it will kind of destroy the whole thing. And have you ever tried to do collaborative storytelling, where you have more than one author writing the same story, but the two authors don't have an agreement on what they're doing? Yeah, that's what happens. When in comic book world, that's fine, because you can change themes every few years. But when you're trying to craft a connected whole narrative, you can't just change course. And that's where things really went wrong with Disney Star Wars. You have literal wars of directors going on behind the scenes and whatnot, and narratives that are anti-narratives to what the original stories were, and everything being turned into political agendas. And it's okay, where's the real storytelling, the art, the craftsmanship that made Star Wars, it made it legendary, made it cross generations? That's all been lost for the sake of whatever the hell is going on now. See, Star Wars is not comic books. It's a whole order of magnitude above comic books, a whole other category, another type of story. And then you have Lord of the Rings, which is a whole other order of magnitude beyond even Star Wars. See, Lord of the Rings was not written originally as just a movie for entertainment. It has its origins all the way into mythology. Tolkien wrote it as a mythology. He drew inspirations from mythology, from culture, from history. It was a crafted masterpiece that was not just, hey, this be fun and cool. And you see, for example, Star Wars, there was a lot of an open canon, you could say, because during the author's own lifetime, there was the expanded universe, there's the video games, and all sorts of extra material was created long before you even get to Disney. And then, of course, Lucas eventually wrote the prequels, and so it was an evolving narrative to a degree. It kind of had an expanding world, but there was still a crafted world. There was a mythos around it, and it was a very cool phenomenon where the fandom actually had participation in growing in that mythos with the video games and expanded universe books, etc. And I won't get further into the history of the Star Wars over the years. That could be a whole another topic there, but it was kind of its own category, its own thing that was not comic books. It was not just new stuff being rebranded. But then coming back to the Lord of the Rings is again a whole other category above. And I don't necessarily mean above as in objectively better. It's just a different style, a different method. Where comic books are way on one side, where everything is changing. Star Wars is in a category where there is a cohesive narrative with a little bit of evolving going around it. Lord of the Rings is written as a history, as a mythology, as a closed canon. The author, Tolkien, was very clear about that. He never approved any adaptations for movies. He did not like edits, rewrites. He had his narrative, his world he was crafting. He was very clear about that. And for nearly 100 years now, everyone has liked what he created. It's legendary to a fairly epic level. And you don't just take that and just say, okay, now we're doing our own new version of it. You don't just get to add to it, take away from it, change it, expand it. And you certainly can't just cram your own modern themes into it. It's not comic books. It's not just some branding material. Crank out this year's new material, whatever you think sells these days. And if you don't understand the differences here, I don't know what to tell you. They're not the same thing. Comic books are not Star Wars, which is not Lord of the Rings. There are different types of narratives. You can't treat them all the same. So, to the casual fans of Lord of the Rings who just like the fantasy world and don't understand why people complain about Rings of Power, why be so picky, come on, why can't we just enjoy having some more content on that universe? Well, the reason why the fans aren't happy is because it's just not that kind of universe. You don't just make new content just for the fun of it. It is a already written, cohesive narrative, and yes, the fans would love to see that narrative brought to life, but that's not what the Rings of Power is doing. They're doing something else, and they're slapping the Lord of the Rings label on it, and that's just not what it is. You don't get to just make something new and throw that label on it. See, there's a reason why Lord of the Rings, as a singular written work, without being changed, without being adapted, has remained popular and universally loved for nearly a century. That's not by accident. It's not just because elves and dwarves are just so dang popular. It was something specific crafted in it, and not everyone has to fully understand it, but it's there. You have to at least acknowledge that it's there. There's something to it that somebody put a lot of work into that made it valuable, that made it meaningful. And if you like the results of it, well, you gotta respect where those results came from. And if you want to try to replicate those results, Well, you have to know how it's done. And it's not done by... Well, it's not done by doing what Rings of Power is doing. By just buying out the rights to use the brand name. Hiring some writers with no previous history or talent. And having them pretend to care about the lore. And then just slap out something full of themes that are completely contrary to the themes of the original source material. It just doesn't work that way. That's why the fans are upset, because to be a fan of Tolkien is not to have just watched a movie that you enjoyed. It's to have read books, lots of them. Books that have depth, books that are not just fun adventure stories. I mean, they are a lot of fun adventures, but they're written in a style it's just a different category, a different sort of story, a different type of narrative. I mean, the idea of a Tolkien scholar, you've heard that term, the Tolkien scholars? That's a real thing. It's not just some sort of fancy label some fans give themselves because they read a lot of books. There are colleges that actually give degree plans in Tolkienology or whatever they call it. I mean, there's full, real universities. You can get a degree in studying Tolkien. It's considered to be a work of literature. You don't get to just hop on there and rewrite it and make a bunch of changes and scramble things around and say, hey, this is just as good. So, sure, when this modern culture of writing and rewriting and rebooting and modern political agenda stuff being shoved in all of the pop culture, when they did it, the comic books, it was like, oh gee, well, that's kind of how they were designed. They were designed to be rewritten to reflect each generation's new attitudes and ideas. But Star Wars was not written that way. So when they did it at Star Wars, it was kind of like, this doesn't work, guys. And now by the time this pattern, they're trying to do it to Tolkien, it's like, we've seen what they did to everything else. We see what they're doing here. But this is a different ballgame, folks. And the fans are going to kind of just stand their ground on this one. Because Tolkien was just that special. The world he created was just that special. It was something unique. And you can't just copy that. You can't just steal that. You can't just appropriate that. No amount of billion-dollar budget or mass media propaganda can just take that away. You can't just change it. You can't just jump on it and turn it into your own thing. It is what it is. And money can't buy that.